Behind every crown lies a heart that beats with human longing. Tonight, we journey through 31 royals whose loves were deemed impossible, not because hearts failed to connect, but because duty, law, and institution stood between desire and fulfillment. From kings who surrendered thrones for forbidden partners to princesses who sacrificed happiness for royal expectations, these are the stories of loves that kingdoms could not permit and hearts could not abandon. Some defied the rules and changed history. Others submitted to duty and lived with regret. All demonstrate that crowns cannot command the heart, no matter how desperately they try. Before we begin, make sure you are subscribed to the channel. Dim the lights, settle in, and let the pace slow. Feel free to leave a comment letting us know where you're listening from. Now let's begin. Number 1. Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson, the king who chose love over empire. What drives a man to surrender the most powerful throne on earth for a woman the world insisted he could not have? Edward VIII's 11-month reign in 1936 ended with abdication that shocked the world and permanently altered the British monarchy, all because he refused to abandon Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee whose past made her constitutionally unacceptable as queen. His relationship with Wallis began in 1934 when she was still married to her second husband. Edward's infatuation was immediate and all-consuming, his behaviour suggesting obsession rather than romantic interest. He showered her with gifts, rearranged his schedule to spend time with her, and made no effort to conceal the relationship despite knowing it violated every expectation for the heir to the throne. When Edward became king in January 1936, the relationship moved from scandalous to constitutionally impossible. Wallis was divorcing her second husband, but even once that divorce became final, she would remain a divorced woman, status that the Church of England could not accept in a queen. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin made clear that the government would not support the marriage, and the Dominions concurred. Edward desperately sought compromise. He proposed morganatic marriage, taking Wallis as wife without making her queen. But Parliament rejected this solution. Every avenue he explored led to the same conclusion. He could be king, or he could marry Wallis Simpson, but he could not do both. His abdication speech on December 11th, 1936, became one of history's most famous broadcasts. Edward explained that he had found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love. The romantic language masked constitutional reality. Edward was choosing personal desire over duty he'd been prepared from birth to fulfill. The immediate consequences reshaped the monarchy fundamentally. His brother George became king overnight, a man who stuttered severely and had never expected to rule. George's eldest daughter Elizabeth became heir presumptive, eventually reigning for 70 years. Edward's choice altered the succession permanently. Edward and Wallis married in June 1937 in France. The title, Her Royal Highness, was specifically withheld from Wallis, the royal family's way of demonstrating that while they accepted the marriage, they would never fully embrace her. This denial became source of bitter resentment for Edward. Their life in exile stretched for 35 years, an existence of luxury but ultimate purposelessness. They maintained expensive residences and travelled extensively, filling their days with social engagements that suggested lives empty of real meaning. The great love story that had required abandoning a throne proved disappointing in practice. Edward's wartime conduct added political scandal to romantic controversy. His meeting with Adolf Hitler in 1937 and apparent sympathy for Nazi Germany suggested catastrophically compromised judgment. Whether this reflected genuine political beliefs or merely resentment remains debated. He died in 1972 at age 77, having spent more than half his life as the king who wasn't. Wallis survived him by 14 years, living increasingly isolated in Paris. Their story remains the most dramatic example of forbidden royal love in British history, a romance that required abandoning a throne and altered the monarchy forever. Number 2. Princess Margaret and Peter Townsend, the princess who chose duty over her heart. How does a woman choose between the man she loves and the institution that defines her entire existence? Princess Margaret faced this impossible decision in the 1950s, when her love for Peter Townsend, a divorced Royal Air Force officer, collided with church doctrine and constitutional constraints that made their marriage legally possible but institutionally catastrophic. Her relationship with Townsend developed gradually through the late 1940s. Townsend served as equerry to King George VI, and his proximity to the royal family allowed genuine friendship to develop with Margaret. He was 16 years older, handsome in the understated way of military heroes, and possessed quiet dignity that contrasted with the often artificial atmosphere of court life. The relationship became publicly visible during Queen Elizabeth's coronation in June 1953, when photographers captured Margaret removing a piece of lint from Townsend's uniform, a gesture of casual intimacy that suggested their connection went beyond formal court relationship. Newspapers immediately recognized the significance, and what had been private matter became international speculation. The constitutional barriers were severe. Townsend's divorce made him unacceptable under church doctrine that the royal family was expected to uphold. The Royal Marriages Act required Margaret to seek the Queen's permission to marry before age 25, and the Queen, advised by the Archbishop of Canterbury and Prime Minister Winston Churchill, could not grant that permission without creating religious and political crisis. The Archbishop made clear that the Church of England could not sanction marriage between Margaret and a divorced man while his former wife still lived. Churchill, concerned about public perception and constitutional precedent, advised against the marriage. Even Commonwealth leaders were consulted, and their response was uniformly negative. The cruel mathematics of the situation gave Margaret a theoretical path forward. If she waited until age 25, she could marry without the Queen's formal consent. However, doing so would require her to renounce her rights to succession and her civil list income. More devastatingly, it would create permanent breach with her family. Margaret was sent to southern Rhodesia in 1953, officially on royal tour, but actually to separate her from Townsend. Townsend was assigned to Brussels as air attaché, effectively exiled from Britain. The separation didn't diminish their feelings, but instead intensified public sympathy for their situation. The decision came in October 1955, when Margaret was 25. She issued a statement explaining that, mindful of the Church's teachings, that Christian marriage is indissoluble, and conscious of my duty to the Commonwealth, I have resolved to put these considerations before others. The language was formal and dignified, but it announced surrender, Margaret choosing institutional duty over personal happiness. The personal cost of this choice marked Margaret for the remainder of her life. Her subsequent marriage to Anthony Armstrong-Jones in 1960 appeared to offer a fresh start, but the relationship proved troubled from the beginning. Their eventual divorce in 1978 suggested that her heart had never fully recovered from the choice she'd made 2 decades earlier. Peter Townsend married Marie-Luce Germain in 1959 and lived quietly until his death in 1995. He rarely spoke publicly about Margaret, maintaining discretion that matched the dignity he'd shown throughout their relationship. Margaret died in 2002 at age 71, having spent her life as the princess who'd chosen duty over love. Her story represents an alternative path to Edward VIII's, where he had defied institution, she had submitted to it, and lived with the consequences. Whether her choice represented admirable responsibility or tragic waste of personal happiness depends on perspective, but the emotional cost was undeniable. Number 3. George IV and Maria Fitzherbert, the prince who married in secret. Can a marriage that violates every legal requirement still be genuine in the eyes of those who enter it? George, Prince of Wales, later George IV, contracted secret marriage with Maria Fitzherbert in December 1785 that was illegal under two separate Acts of Parliament, void in the eyes of the law, yet apparently genuine in his heart. This forbidden love created situation where the heir to the throne maintained what he considered sacred bond that his kingdom refused to recognize. Maria Fitzherbert was everything the Prince of Wales should not have married. She was a commoner, though from respectable Catholic family. More problematically, she was a practicing Catholic at a time when the Act of Settlement barred anyone married to a Catholic from inheriting the throne. Her previous marriages, she'd been widowed twice, further complicated matters. The Church of England considering her unable to marry again while living, George pursued Maria with intensity that bordered on obsession. When she initially refused his advances, understanding the impossibility of their situation, George reportedly stabbed himself and sent her his bloodied shirt to prove the depth of his feeling. Whether this dramatic gesture was genuine suicide attempt or theatrical manipulation, it demonstrated how completely his infatuation had overcome any rational consideration of consequences. The marriage ceremony took place in Maria's drawing room on December 15th, 1785. An Anglican clergyman performed the service, though he did so only after George promised to secure his release from debtor's prison. The ceremony was conducted under duress on the clergyman's part and in complete violation of the Royal Marriages Act on George's part. No member of the royal family attended. No official record was filed. The marriage was secret, illegal, and would never be recognized by the state. Yet George and Maria apparently considered themselves genuinely married. They lived together as husband and wife for years, George showing devotion to Maria that contrasted sharply with his treatment of almost everyone else in his life. For someone whose personal conduct was generally characterized by selfishness and cruelty, his behavior toward Maria suggested capacity for genuine affection that appeared nowhere else in his character. The impossibility of their situation became acute when political pressure forced George to marry legally in 1795. His debts had reached catastrophic levels, and Parliament agreed to settle them only if he produced legitimate heir through proper marriage. George married Caroline of Brunswick in ceremony that was legal, public, and absolutely loveless. He was reportedly drunk at the wedding and spent the wedding night passed out near the fireplace. The existence of two marriages created an absurd situation. Maria was the woman George considered his true wife, the relationship he valued emotionally. Caroline was his legal wife, the marriage recognized by law and church despite being devoid of affection. George maintained relationships with both women while making clear which one held his heart, a situation that satisfied no one and created ongoing scandal. Maria's position throughout this period was extraordinarily difficult. She was George's wife in every way except legally, yet society couldn't acknowledge her as such. She endured public speculation about her relationship with the prince, while having no official recognition or protection. When George eventually became king in 1820, she could not be his queen despite decades of what she considered marriage. Their relationship finally ended in 1811, when George became Prince Regent and apparently decided that maintaining connection to Maria was politically untenable. After 26 years of what Maria considered marriage, George simply stopped seeing her. She lived quietly until her death in 1837, carrying with her the belief that she had been George's true wife, regardless of what the law said. George died in 1830 at age 67, his legal wife Caroline having predeceased him by 9 years. He was buried wearing a miniature of Maria Fitzherbert around his neck, a final gesture suggesting that despite everything, the illegal marriage, the legal wife, the decades of scandal, Maria had been the relationship that mattered to him. Number 4. Prince Augustus Frederick, Duke of Sussex, the prince who married twice against the law. What possesses a man to repeat the same illegal action twice, knowing full well the consequences? Prince Augustus Frederick, sixth son of George III, contracted not one but two marriages in defiance of the Royal Marriages Act, demonstrating either remarkable devotion to personal autonomy or complete inability to learn from experience. Born in 1773, Augustus spent his entire adult life in relationships that the law refused to recognize. His determination to marry for love rather than duty, creating ongoing conflict with his family and the Constitution. His first marriage in 1793 to Lady Augusta Murray was conducted in secret in Rome, far from the oversight of his father and the constraints of English law. Augustus was 20. Augusta was in her late 20s, and their attraction appears to have been genuine. They married twice, once in Rome and again in London, as if repetition might somehow make illegal marriage legal. Both ceremonies violated the Royal Marriages Act, which required all descendants of George II to obtain the monarch's permission before marrying. When George III learned of the marriage, his response was swift and absolute. He declared the marriage null and void. Augustus and Augusta's relationship, and the two children it produced, had no legal standing whatsoever. Their son and daughter were illegitimate in the eyes of the law, despite their parents' genuine belief that they were married. The personal tragedy of this situation was compounded by the fact that Augustus and Augusta apparently loved each other genuinely. The couple separated in 1801, though whether this was due to the legal pressure, personal incompatibility, or other factors remains unclear. Augusta took their children and lived separately, Augustus providing financial support but unable to give them the legal recognition that marriage should have ensured. He had defied the law for love and discovered that the law was more powerful than affection. The truly remarkable aspect of Augustus's story is that he repeated the pattern. In 1831, now 58 years old and theoretically wiser from experience, he married Lady Cecilia Underwood in another ceremony conducted without proper royal permission. Cecilia had been his companion for years, and Augustus apparently decided that he would formalize their relationship, regardless of legal requirements. This second marriage was eventually regularized through retrospective royal consent, making it technically legal, unlike his first. But the fact that Augustus had proceeded without obtaining permission first demonstrated his consistent pattern of prioritizing personal desire over legal requirement. He seemed constitutionally incapable of conforming to the very act designed to control exactly his sort of behavior. Augustus's political sympathies made his illegal marriages even more problematic for the royal family. He supported Catholic emancipation and various liberal causes that embarrassed more conservative family members. His marriages to women without proper royal approval combined with his progressive politics to create a profile of someone who simply refused to behave as royal princes were expected to behave. The children from his first marriage to Augusta Murray existed in painful legal limbo. They were Augustus's children, acknowledged and supported by him, but they could inherit neither titles nor position. His son took the surname d'Este, rather than claiming royal status he could not legally hold. These children's existence served as permanent reminder of Augustus's defiance and the law's inflexibility. Augustus died in 1843 at age 70, having spent his entire adult life in relationships that challenged or violated royal marriage law. His story illustrates the fundamental conflict between personal autonomy and institutional control that characterized royal life. The Royal Marriages Act was designed specifically to prevent royals from making unsuitable matches, and Augustus spent his life demonstrating why some royals considered that control intolerable. His legacy is complicated. He defied unjust law repeatedly, standing up for his right to marry according to his own choice. Yet his defiance created genuine suffering for the women he married and the children he fathered, all of whom bore legal and social consequences of his decisions. Whether his determination to marry for love represented admirable principle or selfish disregard for others depends on perspective. But his refusal to submit to the Royal Marriages Act was absolute and unwavering. Number 5. Prince Michael of Kent and Baroness Marie Christine von Reibnitz, the prince who sacrificed succession for love. Can love be worth permanently surrendering one's place in history? Prince Michael of Kent faced this question in 1978, when his desire to marry Baroness Marie-Christine von Reibnitz collided with the Act of Settlement, which barred anyone married to a Catholic from the line of succession to the British throne. Born in 1942 as grandson of George V, Michael chose love over succession rights, demonstrating that even in the modern era, royal marriages remained subject to constraints that could force impossible choices. Marie-Christine von Reibnitz was beautiful, aristocratic, and Catholic. The first two qualities made her suitable match by social standards, but the third made her constitutionally problematic. The Act of Settlement, passed in 1701, had been designed to ensure Protestant succession and remained in force nearly 3 centuries later. Any royal who married a Catholic automatically forfeited their place in the succession, and any children of such a marriage were similarly excluded. Michael was not close to the throne. He was 15th in line when he married, but the principle mattered. By marrying Marie-Christine, he was accepting that neither he nor any children they might have would ever be eligible for the crown. For someone raised within the royal family, this represented significant sacrifice, even if the likelihood of ever inheriting was remote. The wedding in June 1978 proceeded despite the constitutional implications. Marie-Christine had obtained annulment of her previous marriage from the Catholic Church, allowing the couple to marry in Catholic ceremony, though the annulment was not recognized by the Church of England. This created the familiar royal pattern where different religious authorities held different views of the marriage's validity. The immediate consequence was exactly what the law prescribed. Michael was removed from the line of succession. His children, Lord Frederick Windsor and Lady Gabriella Windsor, were also excluded. The family had made conscious decision that love and personal happiness mattered more than theoretical chance at the throne. What made Michael and Marie-Christine's situation particularly interesting was how it demonstrated the gradual evolution of these restrictions. Unlike earlier royals whose Catholic marriages created major constitutional crises, Michael's choice generated relatively little public controversy. British society had moved beyond the point where Catholic marriages seemed threatening to national identity, even if the law hadn't caught up. The couple's life together proceeded normally by royal standards. They undertook occasional royal duties, maintained presence in royal family events, and generally conducted themselves as other members of the family did. The main difference was the legal exclusion from succession, a restriction that seemed increasingly archaic as decades passed. The Succession to the Crown Act of 2013 finally changed these rules, removing the disqualification for marrying Catholics. However, the change was not made retroactive, meaning Michael's exclusion from the succession remained permanent. He had sacrificed his place in history at a time when the law demanded it, and even though the law eventually changed, his sacrifice remained binding. Marie-Christine's position within the royal family has sometimes been complicated. As a Catholic princess married into Protestant royal family, she occupied unique space. Her strong personality and occasional controversial statements have generated media attention over the years, creating a situation where her presence reminds observers of the religious tensions that her marriage technically violated. Michael's story represents a modern example of forbidden royal love, not forbidden by society or personal objection, but by law that seemed increasingly out of step with contemporary values. Unlike Edward VIII, who gave up the throne itself, Michael surrendered something more abstract: theoretical possibility of succession that would almost certainly never have materialized anyway. Yet, the principle remained significant. Michael chose Marie-Christine knowing that the choice came with constitutional cost. Whether that cost was meaningful given how remote his chances of succession were is debatable, but the fact that the law demanded it at all demonstrated how completely royal marriages remained subject to restrictions that ordinary citizens never faced. His love was forbidden not because anyone objected personally, but because centuries-old law said it must be, and he accepted that cost willingly. Number 6. Charles, Prince of Wales and Camilla Parker Bowles. The love that waited decades. Can a relationship survive decades of separation, public scandal, and institutional opposition to eventually achieve acceptance? Charles, Prince of Wales, now King Charles III, and Camilla Parker Bowles maintained connection that began in the early 1970s, endured through their marriages to other people, and finally resulted in their marriage in 2005 after a journey that tested every boundary of what the monarchy could accommodate. Born in 1948, Charles demonstrated that sometimes forbidden love doesn't end in tragedy, but in patient waiting for the world to change. Their relationship began around 1970, when both were young and unmarried. By all accounts, Charles and Camilla connected genuinely, sharing interests and temperaments that suggested real compatibility. But Camilla was not considered suitable wife for the future king. She lacked the perceived innocence expected of a princess, had previous relationships, and didn't fit the fairy tale image the monarchy believed it needed. Charles's marriage to Diana Spencer in 1981 was celebrated as perfect royal romance. But the relationship with Camilla reportedly never fully ended. Whether it was reignited during Charles and Diana's marriage or had continued throughout remains matter of historical debate. But by the mid-1980s, Camilla's role in Charles's emotional life was significant enough that Diana became aware of it. The institutional resistance to Charles and Camilla's relationship was enormous. The Church of England, of which Charles would eventually be supreme governor, held official positions against divorce and remarriage. The public, having witnessed Diana's suffering and having embraced her as people's princess, viewed Camilla as obstacle to Charles and Diana's happiness, rather than as potential future queen. Diana's death in 1997 transformed the situation completely, but not in ways that helped Charles and Camilla immediately. The extraordinary outpouring of grief demonstrated how beloved Diana had been, and the public's anger at Charles intensified. Camilla became even more controversial figure, blamed by many for the marriage breakdown that had contributed to Diana's unhappiness. The gradual rehabilitation of Camilla's public image took years of careful management. She appeared occasionally with Charles at semi-public events, allowing the public to become accustomed to their partnership without forcing immediate acceptance. The palace managed expectations carefully, understanding that rushing toward marriage would generate backlash that might damage the monarchy itself. Their eventual marriage in April 2005 was deliberately low-key. The civil ceremony at Windsor Guildhall was followed by a religious blessing rather than full church wedding, acknowledging both the legal reality and the religious complications. Queen Elizabeth attended the blessing but not the civil ceremony, a carefully calibrated gesture that suggested acceptance while maintaining appropriate distance. The title Duchess of Cornwall was chosen for Camilla rather than Princess of Wales, recognizing that Diana's connection to that title remained too strong in public memory. Palace officials initially indicated Camilla would be known as Princess Consort when Charles became king rather than Queen Consort, further evidence of sensitivity about public opinion. Yet over time, acceptance grew. Camilla undertook royal duties, supported charitable causes, and gradually demonstrated commitment to the role she'd eventually assume. When Charles became king in 2022, following Queen Elizabeth's death, he made clear that Camilla would indeed be Queen Consort, and public reaction was relatively muted, a remarkable shift from the hostility of earlier decades. Their story illustrates how completely time can transform forbidden love into accepted reality. What was once considered impossible, Charles marrying Camilla and her becoming queen, eventually occurred because patience, changing social attitudes, and persistent commitment outlasted institutional and public resistance. The relationship that began in the 1970s survived through 2 marriages to other people, endured decades of public scandal and disapproval, and finally achieved recognition, demonstrates that some forbidden loves don't end in renunciation or tragedy, but in eventual acceptance when the world changes enough to accommodate them. Number 7. Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. the love that broke a church. Can a king's desire for a woman reshape the religious foundations of an entire nation? Henry VIII's pursuit of Anne Boleyn in the late 1520s led directly to England's break with Rome, creating constitutional and religious revolution, driven by what began as forbidden attraction to a woman he could not legally marry. Born in 1507, Anne Boleyn became the catalyst for transformation that extended far beyond any personal relationship. Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon had lasted over 2 decades when Anne Boleyn arrived at court. Catherine had been his brother's widow, their marriage requiring papal dispensation to permit what canon law generally forbade. By the late 1520s, Henry desperately wanted a male heir that Catherine, now in her 40s, seemed unlikely to provide. Into this situation came Anne Boleyn, beautiful, sophisticated, and utterly different from the women Henry had known. What made this love forbidden was not merely that Henry was already married, but that the Pope refused to grant the annulment Henry desperately sought. Clement VII was politically unable to offend Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, by declaring her marriage invalid. Henry's desire for Anne collided with papal authority, creating a situation where obtaining what he wanted required challenging the entire structure of church authority in England. Anne herself was no passive participant. Unlike her sister Mary, who had apparently been Henry's mistress earlier, Anne refused to become royal mistress. She insisted on marriage or nothing, understanding that only legitimate marriage could give her the status and security she desired. This refusal transformed what might have been merely another royal affair into constitutional crisis, as Henry's desire required not just annulment, but complete restructuring of religious authority. The break with Rome beginning in 1532 was driven by Henry's determination to marry Anne. Parliament passed acts severing England's connection to papal authority, establishing Henry as supreme head of the Church of England, and granting him powers previously held by Rome, all to permit a marriage the Pope had refused to sanction. An entire nation's religious structure changed because one man wanted to marry one woman. Their marriage in January 1533 was conducted before Henry's marriage to Catherine had been formally dissolved by English church authorities, a technical complication that foreshadowed future troubles. Anne was already pregnant, and Elizabeth was born in September 1533. The marriage that had required breaking with Rome seemed initially to justify the upheaval it had caused, but Anne's position was precarious from the start. She had enemies throughout the court who had supported Catherine. The common people largely blamed her for the break with Rome and the dissolution of the monasteries that followed. When she failed to produce the male heir Henry desperately wanted, suffering miscarriages after Elizabeth's birth, her position became actively dangerous. The charges brought against Anne in 1536, adultery with multiple men including her own brother, were almost certainly fabricated to provide legal justification for eliminating her. Henry had tired of Anne and turned his attention to Jane Seymour. But simply divorcing Anne would have acknowledged that the break with Rome had been unnecessary. Instead, executing her for treason allowed Henry to present himself as betrayed husband, rather than as man who'd destroyed England's religious unity for a marriage he'd decided he didn't want after all. Anne was executed in May 1536, less than 3 years after the coronation that had seemed to justify all the religious upheaval. Her daughter Elizabeth eventually became one of England's greatest monarchs, but Anne herself died having been transformed from forbidden love into royal inconvenience that needed elimination. Her story represents forbidden love at its most historically consequential. Unlike Edward VIII, whose abdication affected succession but left institutions intact, Henry's pursuit of Anne fundamentally changed England's religious identity. The break with Rome initiated by his desire to marry her shaped British history for centuries, demonstrating that when forbidden love involves absolute monarchs, the consequences can transform nations. Number 8. James II and Anne Hyde, the prince who married below his station. What happens when a royal prince secretly marries a commoner and then discovers he'll eventually need her to be his queen. James, Duke of York, later James II, contracted secret marriage with Anne Hyde in 1660 that shocked court society and created constitutional complications lasting through his eventual reign. Born in 1633, James demonstrated that even genuine affection couldn't prevent social scandal when royalty married beneath expected station. Anne Hyde served as maid of honour to James's sister Mary, Princess of Orange, and their proximity created opportunity for relationship to develop. Anne was intelligent, capable, and from respectable family. Her father, Edward Hyde, was an important political figure who would later become Earl of Clarendon, but she was emphatically not royalty. For the Duke of York, brother to the king and heir presumptive to the throne, to marry a commoner was unprecedented in recent English history. The marriage became necessary when Anne became pregnant in 1660. James had apparently seduced her with promises of marriage, and when pregnancy made the situation impossible to conceal, he fulfilled that promise through secret ceremony. Contemporary sources suggest James initially considered abandoning Anne despite his responsibility, but ultimately honour or pressure from her family prevailed. The revelation of the marriage created immediate scandal. Charles II was reportedly furious, and courtiers whispered that James had degraded himself and the royal family by marrying so far beneath his station. Several of James's friends claimed publicly that Anne had been their mistress as well, apparently attempting to help James escape the marriage by destroying her reputation. Claims that were almost certainly false, but reflected the desperate desire to undo what had been done. Anne's position as Duchess of York was awkward from the beginning. She had achieved rank through marriage that her birth couldn't have provided, and she faced ongoing resentment from aristocrats who viewed her as interloper. Yet by all accounts she performed her duties capably, bearing James 8 children, though only 2, Mary and Anne, survived to adulthood. What made this forbidden marriage particularly significant was that Anne eventually became mother to 2 queens. Her daughters Mary II and Anne both ruled England, meaning this commoner who had shocked court society by marrying the Duke of York became grandmother to the Hanoverian succession through Anne's marriage to Prince George of Denmark. The religious dimension added further controversy. Anne converted to Catholicism before her death in 1671, creating situation where the Duchess of York and mother to potential queens had embraced the faith that most English subjects deeply distrusted. Whether James's own conversion to Catholicism influenced Anne or vice versa remains debated, but their shared Catholic faith became central to the political crises that eventually cost James his throne. Anne died in 1671 at age 34 before James inherited the throne. She never faced the complications of being queen consort, a position her common birth would have made extraordinarily difficult, despite the legitimacy of her marriage. Her early death perhaps spared both her and James from confronting how the nation would have responded to a common-born queen. James's subsequent marriage to Mary of Modena in 1673 avoided the social complications of his first marriage. Mary was appropriately royal, but it created different problems as another Catholic marriage that intensified Protestant fears about James's religious commitments. The historical significance of James's forbidden marriage to Anne Hyde lies partly in demonstrating that social boundaries could be crossed even in the rigidly hierarchical world of 17th century monarchy. James married for a mixture of affection and obligation, creating union that violated social expectations but produced 2 future queens. The marriage that shocked contemporaries as degrading to royalty ultimately shaped the succession in ways no one anticipated when the secret ceremony occurred in 1660. Number 9. Princess Caroline of Brunswick and her alleged affairs. The queen they tried to destroy. Can accusations of forbidden love be as damaging as actual affairs when deployed as political weapons? Princess Caroline of Brunswick, wife of George IV, faced investigation of her personal conduct that became public spectacle and political crisis. Her alleged relationships examined through proceedings designed more to destroy her reputation than establish truth. Born in 1768, Caroline became victim of forbidden love accusations, whether or not any forbidden love actually occurred. Her marriage to George in 1795 was disastrous from its beginning. George reportedly drunk at the ceremony and showing open contempt for his bride. The couple separated shortly after the birth of their daughter Charlotte in 1796, and Caroline spent years excluded from court life and denied access to her child. In this context of abandonment and isolation, her personal conduct became subject of scrutiny, motivated by George's desire to divorce her. The delicate investigation of 1806 represented the first formal examination of Caroline's alleged affairs. George sought evidence that Caroline had been unfaithful, which would have provided grounds for divorce and freed him from a marriage he despised. The investigation examined claims that Caroline had given birth to an illegitimate child and had conducted affairs with various men. Caroline was ultimately cleared of the most serious charges, though the investigation noted conduct considered inconsistent with her station. What made this situation particularly cruel was that Caroline's alleged forbidden loves were examined publicly, while George's actual affairs were conducted openly with complete impunity. He maintained mistresses, fathered illegitimate children, and generally violated his marriage vows continuously. Yet Caroline faced investigation and potential ruin for relationships that were never proven to have occurred. The double standard was complete and absolute. Caroline's years abroad from 1814 onward provided both freedom and vulnerability. Travelling through Europe, she conducted herself with less restraint than royal dignity traditionally required. Her relationship with Bartolomeo Pergami, an Italian servant, was noted by observers and became central to later proceedings against her. Whether their relationship was physical or merely the close companionship of two people navigating Europe together remained impossible to prove definitively, but appearances suggested intimacy that violated expectations for a Princess of Wales. The pains and penalties. Bill of 1820 represented George's most determined attempt to destroy Caroline through accusations of forbidden love. When George became king, he wanted Caroline prevented from being recognised as queen. Parliament examined evidence of her conduct abroad, particularly her relationship with Pergami in proceedings that became public entertainment. Newspapers reported every salacious detail, and the nation watched as Caroline's personal life was dissected for political purposes. The allegations focused heavily on her travels with Pergami, sharing accommodations, travelling together in circumstances suggesting intimacy, and generally behaving in ways that appeared inappropriate for a married woman of her rank. Whether actual adultery occurred was secondary to the appearance of impropriety, which was damaging enough for George's purposes. Caroline defended herself with dignity throughout proceedings that were designed to humiliate her. The bill ultimately failed to pass Parliament, suggesting either that evidence wasn't convincing or that public sympathy for Caroline outweighed George's political influence. Her treatment generated genuine public support. Crowds cheered her when she appeared, seeing her as victim of cruel husband rather than as adulterer deserving punishment. The coronation crisis of 1821 represented the culmination of years of conflict. George arranged for Caroline to be physically prevented from entering Westminster Abbey for his coronation, guards blocking her repeated attempts to gain entry. The public witnessed this final humiliation, the physical exclusion of a queen from ceremony that should have honoured her marriage. Caroline died 3 weeks after the coronation, her health apparently destroyed by years of persecution and the acute stress of her final public humiliation. Whether her alleged forbidden loves had actually occurred became almost irrelevant. She had been destroyed by accusations whether they were true or false, demonstrated that forbidden love could be wielded as weapon regardless of whether any love had actually been forbidden. Number 10. Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville, the king who chose beauty over alliance. How does a king's decision to marry for love during a civil war create political crisis that nearly destroys his reign. Edward IV's secret marriage to Elizabeth Woodville in 1464 represented forbidden love, not because Elizabeth was unsuitable in character, but because the marriage violated every political necessity of the Wars of the Roses. Born in 1442, Edward demonstrated that even victorious kings could jeopardize their positions through romantic decisions made without regard for political consequence. Elizabeth Woodville was beautiful, intelligent, and from respectable Lancastrian family. But she was also a commoner widow with 2 children from her previous marriage. For the king to marry such a woman, rather than forming alliance with European royalty or powerful English noble family, was unprecedented and politically catastrophic. The marriage took place in secret in May 1464, conducted so quietly that Edward's own court remained unaware for months. Only when political pressure to marry mounted did Edward reveal that he'd already married Elizabeth. The revelation shocked everyone, particularly Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, who had been actively negotiating French marriage alliance on Edward's behalf. Warwick's humiliation at discovering his diplomatic efforts had been rendered pointless by Edward's secret marriage, transformed England's most powerful noble from loyal supporter into dangerous enemy. What made this love forbidden was not legal prohibition, but political necessity that Edward ignored. England was in the midst of civil war between York and Lancaster, and Edward's marriage should have secured vital alliance that might have stabilized his rule. Instead, he married for personal desire, creating a situation where the Woodville family, suddenly elevated through their connection to the Queen, displaced existing power structures. Elizabeth's relatives received titles, estates, and advantageous marriages that had previously been distributed among Edward's supporters. This rapid elevation of the Woodville family generated intense resentment among established nobility who saw themselves being pushed aside by upstarts, whose only qualification was connection to the new Queen. The marriage created an entirely new set of political tensions at precisely the moment when Edward most needed unity. Warwick's eventual rebellion in 1470 directly resulted from rage and humiliation over Edward's marriage. The man who had helped place Edward on the throne now worked to remove him, actually succeeding temporarily in restoring Henry VI. Though Edward ultimately reclaimed his throne through military victory, the instability created by his forbidden marriage nearly cost him his kingdom. The succession implications of Edward's marriage proved catastrophic after his death. When Edward died in 1483, his sons by Elizabeth were young, and the Woodville family's unpopularity meant they lacked the support network necessary to protect a child king. Edward's brother Richard seized the throne, and Edward's sons, the famous princes in the Tower, disappeared, probably murdered. The marriage that Edward had contracted for love had produced heirs, whom the political situation he'd created left fatally vulnerable. Elizabeth herself survived these catastrophes, living through Richard III's usurpation and into Henry VII's reign. She witnessed her daughter Elizabeth of York marry Henry VII, uniting the warring houses and finally achieving the political alliance that Edward's own marriage had failed to secure. She died in 1492, having experienced the highest heights as queen and the lowest depths as mother to murdered children. Edward's forbidden marriage to Elizabeth Woodville demonstrates that romantic love, however genuine, creates political consequences when it conflicts with strategic necessity. His decision to marry for personal desire rather than political advantage destabilized his reign, empowered his enemies, and ultimately left his children vulnerable to the very forces his marriage had inadvertently strengthened. The Wars of the Roses continued partly because Edward had chosen beauty over alliance, love over political wisdom. Number 11. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, the prince who chose freedom over duty. Can a modern royal simply walk away from institutional obligations when love and duty prove incompatible? Prince Harry's relationship with Meghan Markle, beginning in 2016 and culminating in their departure from royal duties in 2020, demonstrated that even in the 21st century, forbidden love could still conflict with royal expectations in ways that forced impossible choices. Born in 1984, Harry showed that contemporary monarchy still demanded sacrifices that some were unwilling to make. Meghan Markle was American, biracial, divorced, and an actress, characteristics that previous generations would have considered absolutely disqualifying for a royal bride, but that modern Britain theoretically accepted. The initial public response to their relationship seemed positive, suggesting that the monarchy had evolved beyond the restrictions that had constrained earlier generations. Their wedding in May 2018 appeared to represent triumph of modern values over outdated prejudices. Meghan's race and American nationality seemed to signal that the monarchy had finally transcended the limitations that had made so many earlier loves forbidden. The ceremony itself incorporated elements reflecting Meghan's background, creating sense that the institution was adapting to accommodate diversity it had historically rejected. Yet the relationship between Meghan and certain elements of British media quickly became toxic. Coverage of Meghan was often negative in ways that suggested racial and cultural bias. Comparisons between how she and Catherine, Duchess of Cambridge, were treated revealing double standards that troubled many observers. Whether this media hostility reflected institutional racism or merely tabloid culture's normal cruelty became subject of intense debate. Harry and Meghan's decision to step back from royal duties in January 2020 created constitutional crisis of modern variety. Unlike Edward VIII, who abdicated entirely, or Princess Margaret, who submitted to institutional demands, Harry and Meghan attempted to create hybrid arrangement, maintaining royal status while pursuing financial independence and living primarily outside Britain. The palace's response made clear this compromise was unacceptable. The final arrangement stripped them of royal patronages and formal duties while allowing them to maintain their titles and pursue independent lives. This created an unprecedented situation where members of close royal family were essentially divorced from the institution while remaining technically royal. The forbidden aspect of their love lay not in legal prohibition, but in incompatibility between Meghan's needs and expectations and what the institution demanded. Their subsequent interviews, particularly with Oprah Winfrey in 2021, made public their grievances about institutional treatment. Allegations of racism within the royal family, claims about lack of support during Meghan's mental health struggles, and descriptions of being trapped within a system that prioritized institution over individual well-being, painted picture of forbidden love, crushed not by law, but by culture. What made Harry and Meghan's story distinctive was its modern dimensions. Unlike historical forbidden loves that were constrained by law or religious doctrine, theirs was theoretically permitted. They married legally and with family blessing. Yet the practical reality proved incompatible with happiness. The institutional demands and media persecution creating an environment where love required leaving rather than submitting. The public response divided sharply. Supporters saw Harry as prioritizing his wife's well-being over institutional demands, an admirable act of protection. Critics viewed their departure as abandonment of duty and their public complaints as inappropriate airing of family grievances. The division reflected broader questions about what monarchy should be in modern era and whether individual happiness should ever take precedence over institutional obligation. Their life in California, away from royal duties but still pursued by media attention, represents a new form of forbidden love resolution, neither complete abdication nor submission to duty, but attempted creation of alternative existence that honors love while acknowledging royal connection. Whether this arrangement proves sustainable remains to be seen, but it demonstrates that forbidden love in the modern monarchy takes forms that previous generations couldn't have imagined. Number 12. Princess Anne and Timothy Lawrence, the princess who found love after duty. Can a royal find genuine happiness in second marriage when the first was conducted according to duty, but the second follows the heart? Princess Anne's relationship with Timothy Lawrence began while both were married to other people, creating a situation that generated significant public scrutiny despite the discretion with which they conducted themselves. Born in 1950, Anne demonstrated that even late 20th century royals faced complications when personal feelings conflicted with existing commitments. Anne's first marriage to Captain Mark Phillips in 1973 appeared to meet all requirements for suitable royal marriage. Phillips was from appropriate background, their shared interest in equestrianism provided common ground, and the match generated positive public response. The marriage produced 2 children and lasted 15 years before separation became inevitable, driven by incompatibilities that time made impossible to ignore. Timothy Lawrence was a Royal Navy officer who served as Queen Elizabeth's equerry, bringing him into regular contact with the royal family. His relationship with Anne developed gradually, friendship deepening into something more, while both remained married to other people. The discovery of their relationship occurred when personal letters from Lawrence to Anne were stolen and offered to newspapers in 1989. The revelation created an awkward situation. Anne was still married to Phillips, though their marriage was clearly failing. Lawrence was married as well. The existence of letters suggesting romantic relationship while both parties remained in other marriages generated media attention and public speculation about whether lines of appropriate conduct had been crossed. What made this love complicated rather than strictly forbidden was timing. There was no evidence of physical affair before separations occurred, but the emotional connection that led to their eventual marriage clearly existed while both were committed elsewhere. This grey area, where feelings develop before circumstances permit acting on them, created a situation where judgment depended on where one drew lines about appropriate conduct. Anne and Phillips formally separated in 1989 and divorced in 1992. Lawrence's marriage similarly ended. Once both were legally free, their relationship could proceed openly, though questions about when it truly began lingered in public consciousness. The Church of England's official position against remarriage of divorced persons while former spouses lived meant Anne and Lawrence could not marry in traditional Anglican ceremony. Their wedding in December 1992 took place at Church of Scotland in small private ceremony. The location choice was both practical. The Church of Scotland permitted such marriages, and symbolic, allowing the marriage to proceed without challenging Church of England doctrine directly. The wedding was small and notably private compared to Anne's first marriage, reflecting both the couple's preferences and the complicated circumstances. What distinguishes this forbidden love from others in this collection is its relatively quiet resolution. Unlike Edward VIII, whose choice created constitutional crisis, or Princess Margaret, whose renunciation generated decades of tragedy, Anne simply waited until circumstances permitted her marriage to Lawrence, and then proceeded with minimal drama. The institutional complications existed, but proved manageable through patient navigation, rather than requiring dramatic sacrifice or defiance. Their marriage has proven notably successful and stable, lasting over 30 years and characterized by mutual support and discretion. Lawrence accepted role as royal spouse without seeking spotlight, supporting Anne's royal duties while maintaining his own career. The relationship that began in complicated circumstances developed into partnership that weathered challenges earlier royal marriages often failed to survive. Anne's story illustrates that forbidden love in modern monarchy sometimes finds resolution through patience and changing circumstances, rather than through tragedy or sacrifice. The relationship that generated scandal when it began proved durable enough to outlast criticism, demonstrating that genuine compatibility matters more than perfect timing or uncomplicated origins. Number 13. Queen Victoria and John Brown, the widow who found comfort in controversy. Can a queen's dependence on a servant cross boundaries that make an entire nation uncomfortable? Queen Victoria's relationship with John Brown, her Scottish gillie, generated persistent speculation and controversy throughout the decades following Prince Albert's death in 1861. Born in 1819, Victoria demonstrated that grief could create attachments that appeared inappropriate regardless of their actual nature, forbidden love existing as much in perception as in reality. Albert's death devastated Victoria so completely that she withdrew from public life almost entirely, spending years in mourning that seemed to have no end. In this context of overwhelming grief and isolation, John Brown became increasingly important to her daily life. He was blunt, unpretentious, and treated Victoria with familiarity that shocked courtiers accustomed to rigid protocol. Brown would speak to her informally, call her woman rather than using her titles, and generally behave with intimacy that violated every convention governing royal servant relationships. The nature of Victoria's dependence on Brown generated speculation that ranged from suggestion of romantic attachment to rumours of secret marriage. The nickname Mrs. Brown circulated in newspapers and private conversations, capturing public suspicion that the relationship had crossed appropriate boundaries. Whether these suspicions reflected actual conduct or merely society's difficulty understanding intense emotional connection between queen and servant remained subject of debate. What made this relationship seem forbidden was not any proven physical intimacy, but the social impossibility of a queen relying so heavily on someone so far beneath her station. Brown was a servant, devoted and faithful, but emphatically not royalty or even gentry. For the Queen of England to show such visible dependence on him suggested either that grief had compromised her judgment, or that the relationship involved something beyond appropriate master-servant dynamics. Victoria's own family was troubled by Brown's influence. Her children resented how completely their mother had come to depend on someone they viewed as mere servant. Brown controlled access to Victoria, influenced her schedule and decisions, and generally exercised authority that seemed inappropriate for his position. Whether this reflected manipulation on Brown's part or simply Victoria filling void left by Albert's death with the most devoted person available, the result was a situation that made the royal household uncomfortable. Brown's behaviour toward Victoria seemed to confirm suspicions about inappropriate intimacy. He was protective to the point of possessiveness, treating her with familiarity that suggested he viewed himself as something more than servant. Contemporary accounts describe him entering her rooms without announcement, insisting on certain arrangements for her comfort, and generally acting with authority that exceeded his official position. The political dimensions added complications. Victoria's withdrawal from public duties generated parliamentary frustration, and her visible dependence on Brown, while neglecting royal obligations, suggested priorities that troubled those who believed monarchy required public presence. That she couldn't perform royal duties but could spend time with Brown created impression of someone who had replaced appropriate relationships with inappropriate ones. Brown died in 1883, and Victoria's grief was profound and publicly visible. She commissioned memorials to him, wore jewellery containing his image, and generally mourned him in ways that suggested loss of someone far more important than a servant. Her insistence on honouring his memory despite family opposition demonstrated that whatever their relationship had been, it had been central to her emotional life during the decades of widowhood. After Victoria's death in 1901, her family moved quickly to minimise Brown's legacy. Letters between Victoria and Brown were destroyed, monuments to him were removed from public places, and generally his memory was erased as thoroughly as possible from the official record. This destruction of evidence means historians can never know definitively whether the relationship crossed physical boundaries, but the family's determination to erase all trace of it suggests they believed it had been at minimum emotionally inappropriate. Victoria's relationship with John Brown represents forbidden love existing primarily in perception and possibility rather than documented fact. Whether they were romantically involved matters less historically than the reality that a queen's dependence on a servant generated scandal that damaged her reputation and troubled her family. The relationship that sustained Victoria through her grief became source of national embarrassment precisely because it violated social hierarchies that even queens were expected to respect. Number 14, Charles II and Nell Gwyn, the king who chose the orange seller. Picture the King of England, desperately in love with a woman who sold oranges in the theatre. Charles II's relationship with Nell Gwyn wasn't just unconventional, it was scandalous beyond measure. Nell Gwyn started life in the gutters of Restoration London. Born into poverty, she hawked oranges at the King's Theatre before becoming one of the era's most celebrated actresses. But acting itself was considered barely respectable. Actresses were viewed as little better than courtesans, their profession synonymous with loose morals and impropriety. Then the king saw her perform. Charles was captivated not just by her beauty, but by her wit, her vivacity, her complete lack of pretension. Unlike the scheming nobility surrounding him, Nell was genuine, funny, and refreshingly honest. She made him laugh in ways no one else could. Their affair became the talk of London. The common people adored her. She was one of them, after all. But the court was horrified. How could the king parade around with a common actress? Where was the dignity of the crown? His advisors warned him constantly that this relationship undermined royal authority and set a terrible precedent. Nell never pretended to be anything she wasn't. When an angry mob once mistook her carriage for that of the king's Catholic mistress, she famously stuck her head out and shouted, "Pray, good people, be civil, I am the Protestant whore." The crowd erupted in cheers. Charles kept other mistresses, powerful noblewomen who played political games, but Nell remained his favourite. She never demanded titles for herself, though Charles made their two sons dukes. She never meddled in politics or tried to accumulate wealth like the others. She just loved him, genuinely and completely. The relationship defied every expectation of kingship. Monarchs were supposed to maintain dignity, marry for dynasty, and if they took mistresses, they should at least be from respectable families. Charles didn't care. In Nell, he found something rare for a king: authenticity and unconditional affection. When Charles died in 1685, his last words reportedly included, "Let not poor Nellie starve." Even on his deathbed, he worried about protecting the orange seller from Drury Lane, who had captured his heart so completely. The king and the actress, a love that refused to acknowledge the impossible gulf between their worlds. Number 15, Charles II and Louise de Querouaille, the French mistress who threatened a nation. While Nell Gwyn made Charles laugh, Louise de Querouaille made his government nervous. This wasn't just another royal affair. It was a political crisis wrapped in silk and perfume. Louise arrived in England in 1670 as part of King Louis XIV's court, sent to attend Charles's sister. Beautiful, sophisticated, and impeccably French, she was everything the English court expected in a royal mistress. But there was a problem. She was Catholic, and possibly a French spy. England in the 1670s was paranoid about Catholic influence. The country had fought brutal religious wars, executed a Catholic queen, and lived in constant fear of papal plots. Having a Catholic mistress in the king's bed wasn't just morally questionable, it was seen as a national security threat. Charles fell hard for Louise. Unlike Nell's boisterous warmth, Louise brought continental elegance and refinement. He showered her with unprecedented gifts: titles, estates, a duchy. She became Duchess of Portsmouth, one of the most powerful women in England. Her apartments at Whitehall were more lavish than the Queen's, but Louise's influence terrified Parliament. Many believed she was feeding state secrets directly to the French king. When England's foreign policy suddenly seemed to align suspiciously well with French interests, fingers pointed straight at her. Pamphlets circulated calling her the Catholic whore and accusing her of manipulating Charles toward Catholic sympathies. The political establishment tried everything to break Charles's infatuation. They offered alternative mistresses, spread rumours, and openly criticised Louise in Parliament. Nothing worked. Charles defended her fiercely, even when it damaged his political standing. What made this forbidden love so dangerous wasn't just religion, it was the intersection of romance and geopolitics. Every whisper Louise made in Charles's ear could shift the balance of European power. Every gift he gave her suggested he valued French interests over English ones. Their private relationship became a public matter of state security. Louise bore Charles a son, further cementing her position. The boy was made Duke of Richmond, ensuring her place in history, but she never escaped the suspicion and hatred that followed her. Even after Charles's death, Louise remained controversial. She had to flee to France during the anti-Catholic panic that followed. The beautiful Frenchwoman who captured a king's heart became a symbol of everything England feared: foreign influence, Catholic conspiracy, and the dangerous power of royal desire over national interest. Number 16, James II and Arabella Churchill, the Catholic king's contradictory heart. Before James became the last Catholic king of England, he was a young duke with wandering eyes. His affair with Arabella Churchill began as a typical aristocratic liaison, but it became something far more complicated, entangled in the religious and political tensions that would eventually cost James his throne. Arabella was sister to the future Duke of Marlborough, one of England's greatest military commanders. She served as maid of honour to James's first wife, Anne Hyde. Court positions like this were prestigious, but they came with an unspoken risk: the constant attention of powerful men. James, then Duke of York, noticed Arabella around 1665. She wasn't considered a great beauty by court standards. Contemporaries described her as plain, even awkward-looking. But James was drawn to her intelligence and gentle nature. Their affair began quietly, as these things did at court. Then, Arabella became pregnant. This happened 3 more times. James fathered 4 children with her, even while married to Anne Hyde. The relationship continued for nearly a decade, an open secret that scandalized the court, but couldn't be publicly acknowledged. What made this affair particularly problematic was timing. James had converted to Catholicism, a decision that horrified Protestant England. His brother Charles had no legitimate children, making James heir to the throne. The prospect of a Catholic king was terrifying enough, but a Catholic king with a mistress and illegitimate children. It suggested moral corruption alongside religious betrayal. James's affair with Arabella defied multiple levels of propriety. He was committing adultery, fathering bastards, and doing it all while positioning himself as a devout Catholic. The hypocrisy was staggering, even by Restoration standards, where royal mistresses were common. When Anne Hyde died in 1671, there was brief speculation James might marry Arabella. He didn't. Instead, he married Mary of Modena, another Catholic, further inflaming Protestant fears. Arabella was quietly married off to a compliant courtier who accepted James's children as his own. The 4 children James had with Arabella lived complicated lives. They bore the taint of illegitimacy but enjoyed royal favour. James acknowledged them, provided for them, and one daughter even became a nun, perhaps seeking to atone for her irregular birth. This forbidden love revealed the impossible contradictions in James's character. Devoutly Catholic, yet morally compromised, politically tone-deaf, yet personally passionate. The same reckless disregard for consequences that led him into Arabella's bed would eventually lead him to lose his crown. Number 17. Prince Albert Victor, the heir shrouded in whispers and scandal. Prince Albert Victor, known as Eddie, remains one of the most mysterious figures in royal history. The eldest son of the future, Edward VII, he should have become king. Instead, he died at 28, leaving behind a wake of rumours, speculation, and unanswered questions about his romantic life. Eddie was, by most accounts, not particularly bright. His tutors despaired of his inability to focus. He drifted through royal duties with apparent disinterest. prompting constant concern from his family about his fitness for kingship. But it was his rumoured personal life that truly alarmed the royal establishment. Whispers followed Eddie everywhere. Some said he frequented male brothels in London's seedier districts. Others claimed he was involved in the Cleveland Street scandal of 1889, where a homosexual brothel was raided and several prominent men were implicated. Eddie's name surfaced in gossip, though nothing was ever proven. The royal family moved quickly to protect him. If the rumours were true, Eddie's indiscretions threatened the monarchy itself. Homosexual acts were illegal, criminalised under laws that sent men to prison with hard labour. The heir to the heir couldn't be associated with such perversion. Then there were the women. Eddie was reportedly infatuated with Princess Hélène of Orléans, a Catholic French princess. This created an impossible situation. The future King of England couldn't marry a Catholic without triggering a constitutional crisis. Hélène was willing to convert to Protestantism for him, but the Pope refused permission. The romance ended, leaving Eddie heartbroken. Desperate to settle him down, Queen Victoria arranged for Eddie to propose to Princess Mary of Teck. Mary accepted, though whether Eddie truly loved her remains unclear. The engagement seemed designed more to domesticate a wayward prince than to celebrate genuine affection. Before the wedding could take place, Eddie contracted influenza during the pandemic of 1891 to 1892. He died within days, with Mary at his bedside. The outpouring of public grief was immense, but behind palace doors, there may have been quiet relief. After his death, even more sensational rumours emerged. Some conspiracy theories absurdly claimed he was Jack the Ripper. Others suggested he'd been murdered to prevent scandal. None of these theories held up to scrutiny, but they revealed how mysterious Eddie had become. What's true? We'll likely never know for certain. Eddie's rumoured relationships, whether with men, inappropriate women, or unsuitable princesses, represented everything the Victorian monarchy feared: scandal, illegality, and dysfunction at the very heart of the succession. His early death allowed the rumours to be buried with him, preserving the crown, but leaving Eddie's true story lost to history. Number 18. Princess Louise, Duchess of Argyll, the artist who defied Victorian chains. Princess Louise was Queen Victoria's most unconventional daughter, and the rumours that swirled around her romantic life scandalised Victorian society for decades. Beautiful, artistic, and fiercely independent, Louise refused to conform to the suffocating expectations placed on royal women. Victoria's daughters were expected to marry German princes and produce heirs. Louise wanted none of it. She was a talented sculptor, a progressive thinker, and someone who chafed at every royal restriction. At a time when princesses were meant to be decorative and obedient, Louise was neither. In 1871, Louise did something revolutionary. She married a British nobleman instead of foreign royalty. The Marquess of Lorne, heir to the Duke of Argyll, was handsome, cultured, and Protestant. It seemed perfect. It wasn't. The marriage was reportedly never consummated. Rumours immediately began circulating about why. Some said Lorne was homosexual, preferring male companions to his royal wife. Others whispered that Louise had taken lovers of her own. Still others claimed the couple simply found each other incompatible and lived essentially separate lives. Then came the really scandalous rumours. Louise spent considerable time with her sculpture tutor, Joseph Edgar Boehm. He was a successful artist, but he was also married and a commoner. In 1890, Boehm died suddenly in his studio. Some accounts suggest Louise was present when he collapsed, possibly during an intimate encounter. The royal family moved swiftly to suppress any scandal. Details of Boehm's death were carefully managed. Louise's name was kept out of public speculation. But the whispers never stopped. Had the princess been having an affair with her art instructor? Louise's relationship with her mother became increasingly strained. Victoria disapproved of Louise's independent spirit and suspected her daughter's moral conduct was unbecoming of a princess. The Queen kept Louise at arm's length, never quite trusting her. There were other rumours too. Some claimed Louise had given birth to an illegitimate child who was quietly adopted away. No evidence has ever substantiated this, but the story persists in royal lore, fueled by Louise's long absences from court and her unusual degree of freedom. What made Louise's situation so difficult was the impossibility of her position. She was too intelligent and creative to be satisfied with the limited role assigned to royal women. But she was also too royal to live the independent artistic life she craved. She existed in a painful middle ground, belonging fully to neither world. Louise outlived most of her siblings, dying in 1939 at 91. She never divorced Lorne despite their unhappy marriage. She never publicly addressed the rumours. She remained an enigma, a royal rebel whose true romantic life stayed tantalizingly hidden behind palace walls and Victorian propriety. Number 19. Princess Stephanie of Belgium and Crown Prince Rudolph, the murder-suicide that shocked Europe. This isn't purely a British royal story, but its tragic ending sent shockwaves through every European monarchy, including Britain's. The doomed relationship between Austria's Crown Prince Rudolph and his involvement with forbidden love led to one of the 19th century's most shocking scandals, the Meiling incident. Rudolph was heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, married to Princess Stephanie of Belgium in an arranged political marriage. On paper, it looked perfect. Two royal houses united. In reality, it was a disaster. Rudolph found Stephanie boring and unsophisticated. Stephanie found Rudolph unstable and unfaithful. Neither bothered to hide their mutual contempt. Rudolph spiraled into depression, liberalism, and increasingly reckless behaviour. He took multiple mistresses, drank heavily, and clashed constantly with his conservative father, Emperor Franz Joseph. The marriage produced one daughter, then Rudolph essentially abandoned Stephanie emotionally. He became obsessed with a 17-year-old baroness named Mary Vetsera. She was beautiful, romantic, and utterly infatuated with the crown prince. Rudolph saw in her an escape from his suffocating royal existence. Mary saw in him a fairy tale prince. What happened next shocked the world. In January 1889, Rudolph and Mary were found dead at the Meiling hunting lodge. Rudolph had shot Mary, then turned the gun on himself. The murder-suicide devastated the Habsburg dynasty and traumatized Europe. The scandal's ripples reached every royal house. Queen Victoria was horrified. This was the kind of romantic excess and moral collapse that she feared most. The fact that it involved arranged marriage gone wrong, illicit affairs, and violent death confirmed every anxiety about royal duty versus personal desire. The Austro-Hungarian government tried desperately to control the narrative. They suggested Rudolph died of heart failure, then poisoning, before finally admitting the truth under pressure. Mary's body was quickly buried in secret to minimize scandal. Stephanie was left in an impossible position, widowed by a husband who'd never loved her, publicly humiliated by his suicide with a teenage mistress. The Meiling tragedy became a cautionary tale about the dangers of forbidden royal love. Here was the ultimate price of passion colliding with duty, death, disgrace, and dynastic disaster. It proved that royal marriages based purely on political advantage, without regard for compatibility or affection, could end catastrophically. British royals watched nervously. If it could happen to the Habsburgs, it could happen to anyone. The incident reinforced the determination of monarchies everywhere to control their members' romantic choices, to prevent personal feelings from destroying centuries-old institutions. Stephanie eventually remarried to a Hungarian count. She outlived Rudolph by decades, but never escaped the shadow of Meiling. The girl bride in an arranged marriage became a symbol of royal relationships gone tragically wrong. Number 20. George III and Hannah Lightfoot, the secret marriage that never was. What if the King of England had contracted a secret illegal marriage before his coronation? What if the entire royal succession was based on a lie? This is the persistent, probably false, but absolutely fascinating rumour about George III and a Quaker girl named Hannah Lightfoot. The story goes like this. Young Prince George, before becoming king, fell in love with Hannah Lightfoot, the beautiful daughter of a shoemaker. She was a Quaker, a commoner, and completely inappropriate for a future monarch. According to legend, George was so besotted that he secretly married her in the 1750s. If true, this would have been catastrophic. The Royal Marriages Act would later formalise what was already understood. Royals needed permission to marry. A secret marriage to a commoner would have been invalid and possibly treasonous. Any children from such a union would have no claim to the throne. The rumour gets even more dramatic. Some versions claim Hannah bore George children who were hidden away to protect the succession. Others say she was forcibly separated from George when he became king and had to marry Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz for political reasons. Where did this story come from? Partly from George's enemies, who loved to suggest the king's legitimacy was questionable, partly from a few suspicious documents that surfaced over the years claiming to prove the marriage, and partly from the simple fact that George's early personal life before becoming king was relatively undocumented. The rumour gained traction because it was romantic and subversive. The idea of a secret youthful marriage, tragically ended by royal duty, appealed to everyone who ever felt trapped by social expectations. It also provided ammunition for those who wanted to undermine the Hanoverian succession. Here's what we actually know. Hannah Lightfoot was real. She was a Quaker from Wapping. She disappeared from public records around the time she would have supposedly met Prince George. But there's zero reliable evidence she ever encountered the prince, let alone married him. The few documents supporting the marriage have been examined by historians and dismissed as forgeries. They appear to have been created decades after the supposed events, likely to support financial claims or political agendas. No contemporary source, not even gossipy letters or diaries, mentions any such relationship. Yet the rumour won't die. It appears in novels, conspiracy theories, and speculative histories. Why? Because it touches something fundamental about forbidden royal love. The fantasy that even a future king might sacrifice everything for genuine affection, that true love might exist beyond the cold calculations of dynasty and duty. George III's actual marriage to Charlotte was arranged, but became genuinely affectionate. They had 15 children, and by royal standards, a stable relationship. The Hannah Lightfoot story is almost certainly fiction, but it endures as a beautiful, impossible dream of royal rebellion. Number 21. Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, and Lady Alice Montagu. Douglas Scott, the quiet prince who chose his own heart. Not all forbidden royal loves involved scandal and crisis. Some were simply quiet struggles against subtle resistance, fought by people who wanted nothing more than to marry for affection rather than pure political advantage. Prince Henry and Lady Alice's romance was one of these. Henry was George V's third son, the spare to the spare. Born in 1900, he grew up knowing he was unlikely to inherit the throne, which gave him slightly more freedom than his elder brothers. He became a military man, serving in the cavalry, and preferred the straightforward world of soldiers to the complexities of court life. Lady Alice Montagu. Douglas Scott came from one of Scotland's most distinguished noble families. Her father was the Duke of Buccleuch, a title dating back centuries. She was beautiful, intelligent, and impeccably bred. On paper, she was perfect for a royal marriage. Yet there was quiet resistance to their relationship in the 1930s. Why? Partly because the royal family had become hypersensitive about marriages after the Edward VIII crisis. Every romantic decision was scrutinised for potential scandal. Partly because there were whispers that Alice's family, while noble, wasn't quite royal enough. They were aristocrats, not foreign princesses. George V and Queen Mary preferred their children to marry into foreign royal houses, maintaining the traditional web of European dynastic connections. They wanted German, Danish, or Russian royalty, not British nobility, no matter how distinguished. Marrying within Britain seemed almost like marrying down. Henry was quiet, but determined. He loved Alice genuinely, not because she represented a political alliance, but because she was kind, steady, and understood him. In an era when royal marriages were still primarily transactional, wanting to marry for love was quietly revolutionary. The couple faced subtle pressure to reconsider. Suggestions were made about more suitable foreign princesses. Delays were encouraged, hoping Henry's feelings would cool, but Henry refused to budge, and Alice waited patiently. The death of Alice's father just weeks before their wedding in 1935 nearly postponed everything. Court protocols demanded extended mourning. But Henry pushed forward, and they married in a quieter ceremony than originally planned. Queen Mary attended, but remained somewhat frosty about the whole affair. Their marriage proved the skeptics wrong. Henry and Alice were devoted to each other for 43 years, until Henry's death in 1974. They had 2 sons and lived relatively quietly, away from the spotlight that consumed other royals. What made their love forbidden wasn't anything dramatic. No divorces, no scandals, no constitutional crises. It was simply that they wanted to choose for themselves in a system designed to deny choice. They wanted affection in a world that prioritized alliance, and they had to fight, gently but persistently, for the simple right to marry the person they actually loved. Number 22, Princess Beatrice and Prince Henry of Battenberg, the daughter held hostage by grief. Queen Victoria's youngest daughter Beatrice had perhaps the strangest forbidden love story in royal history. It wasn't forbidden by law or religion. It was forbidden by one person, her mother, who couldn't bear to lose her. Beatrice was born in 1857, the baby of Victoria's 9 children. After Prince Albert died in 1861, Victoria sank into decades of mourning. She demanded that Beatrice remain single to serve as her permanent companion, secretary, and comfort. Beatrice accepted this sacrifice, dutifully staying by her mother's side into her late 20s. Then, in 1884, Beatrice met Prince Henry of Battenberg at a family wedding. He was handsome, charming, and everything Beatrice's narrow life had lacked. They fell in love almost immediately. Beatrice, at 27, had never experienced anything like it. She gathered her courage and told Victoria she wanted to marry. The Queen's reaction was volcanic. Marry? Leave her? Absolutely not. Victoria didn't shout. That wasn't her style. Instead, she froze Beatrice out completely, refusing to speak to her daughter for months. She communicated only through written notes, expressing her bitter disappointment. For 7 months, Beatrice lived in her mother's house, eating at her mother's table, performing her daily duties, all while Victoria maintained icy silence. The emotional torture was calculated and effective. Victoria believed if she just remained firm enough, Beatrice would abandon this foolish romantic notion. But Beatrice didn't break. She loved Henry too much. Finally, a compromise was brokered by other family members. Beatrice could marry Henry if, and only if, they lived with Victoria. Henry would give up his military career and independence. The couple would essentially become Victoria's servants, sacrificing their own household for the Queen's comfort. It was an extraordinary demand, even by royal standards. What man would agree to such terms? Henry loved Beatrice enough to accept. They married in 1885 and, true to the agreement, moved in with Victoria. The arrangement was as awkward as it sounds. Henry and Beatrice had no private life. Their 4 children were raised under Victoria's watchful, controlling eye. Every decision required the Queen's approval. Henry chafed at his powerless position, a prince reduced to his mother-in-law's dependent. Yet somehow, the marriage survived. Henry and Beatrice remained genuinely devoted to each other despite the impossible circumstances. They found small freedoms where they could, brief trips away from Victoria's court, quiet moments of privacy. When Henry died of fever in 1896 after a military expedition, Beatrice was devastated. She spent the remaining 48 years of her life in mourning, wearing black and living quietly. She never remarried, never recovered from losing the one person she'd fought so hard to have. Victoria eventually admitted, grudgingly, that Henry had been a good husband. But she never apologized for the 7 months of silence, for the years of control, for making her daughter's marriage conditional on her own comfort. Beatrice's forbidden love wasn't forbidden by church or state. It was forbidden by maternal tyranny, by a grief-stricken queen who couldn't let go. Number 23. Princess Mary, daughter of George V, the obedient daughter who never rebelled. Princess Mary was born in 1897, the only daughter among George V and Queen Mary's 6 children. Being the sole girl in a family of boys created unique pressures, and her romantic life became a casualty of those expectations and the rigid royal protocols of her era. Mary grew up in an extremely formal household. George V and Queen Mary were loving but distant parents who believed in duty above all else. Affection was rarely displayed, emotions were controlled, and royal obligation always came first. Mary learned early that her feelings mattered less than her family's needs. As she reached marriageable age in the late 1910s, Mary faced the reality of early 20th century royal life. She had almost no autonomy in choosing a husband. The First World War had destroyed many European monarchies and killed numerous potential royal suitors. The pool of acceptable candidates was shrinking. George V believed his daughter should marry strategically, someone who would strengthen British interests. Mary's own preferences were essentially irrelevant. She was expected to accept whomever her parents selected, smile appropriately, and fulfill her dynastic duty. There are hints, never confirmed but persistent in family lore, that Mary may have had romantic feelings for someone unsuitable. Perhaps a courtier, perhaps a military officer. Whoever it was, the relationship could never be acknowledged. Mary was taught from birth that royal women didn't marry for love. They married for England. In 1922, Mary married Viscount Lascelles, who later became the Earl of Harewood. He was 15 years her senior, wealthy, and acceptable to her parents. The marriage was announced as a love match, but many observers noted Mary's lack of enthusiasm. She performed her role perfectly, as she'd been trained to do, but there was little joy in it. The marriage produced 2 sons, securing the succession for the Lascelles line. But by most accounts, it was not a happy union. Lascelles was difficult, demanding, and unfaithful. Mary endured it all with the same stoic duty she'd been raised to exhibit. Royal women didn't complain, didn't divorce, didn't acknowledge unhappiness. What makes Mary's story particularly poignant is its quiet desperation. She never rebelled like her brother Edward VIII would. She never complained publicly. She simply accepted that her romantic autonomy had been sacrificed to her family's expectations. Mary spent her life performing royal duties impeccably. She was conscientious, hard-working, and devoted to her royal role. But those close to her noticed an underlying sadness, a sense of opportunities lost and choices never made. She outlived her husband by 16 years, dying in 1965. Only after his death did she seem to find some peace, spending her final years more freely, making her own decisions at last. Mary's forbidden love, if it existed, was forbidden simply because she was royal and female. Her brothers had slightly more freedom, but as George V's only daughter, she was expected to be perfectly obedient, perfectly dutiful, and perfectly willing to sacrifice personal happiness for family expectations. The greatest tragedy is that she was. Number 24. Princess Helena and Prince Christian of Schleswig-Holstein, the bride who sparked diplomatic fury. Princess Helena, Queen Victoria's third daughter, experienced one of the more politically complicated romantic situations in the royal family. Her engagement and marriage became entangled in the messy territorial disputes that plagued European politics in the 1860s. Helena was born in 1846, falling in the middle of Victoria's large brood of children. She wasn't as beautiful as her sister Alice, or as clever as Louise, but she was dutiful, practical, and devoted to her mother. After Albert's death, Helena became one of Victoria's primary caregivers, managing the Queen's correspondence and household. Victoria had decided that Helena must remain in England after marriage, unlike her older sisters, who had married foreign princes and moved away. This severely limited Helena's romantic options. She needed a husband who was royal enough to be acceptable, but powerless enough to agree to live in England under Victoria's thumb. Prince Christian of Schleswig-Holstein seemed to fit these requirements. He was a minor German prince, well-mannered and compliant. There was just one enormous problem. His family was at the center of a territorial war that had nearly torn Europe apart. The Schleswig-Holstein question was one of the most complex political issues of the 19th century. Lord Palmerston famously said only 3 people had ever understood it. Prince Albert, who was dead, a German professor who had gone mad, and himself, and he'd forgotten it. The region was disputed between Denmark, Prussia, and various German states. Christian's family had claims to Schleswig-Holstein that put them in direct conflict with Denmark and Prussia. Prussia had recently seized the territories, making Christian's family essentially dispossessed claimants. This created immediate diplomatic problems. When Helena's engagement was announced in 1866, the reaction was fierce. The Danish royal family was furious. They had just fought a war over Schleswig-Holstein and saw Christian's family as enemies. Helena's sister Alexandra had married the Prince of Wales and was the future queen. She was Danish and took the affront personally. Alexandra openly opposed the marriage. She refused to attend family gatherings if Christian would be present. The Prince of Wales backed his wife, creating a rift in the royal family. Victoria, characteristically, didn't care about anyone else's feelings and pushed forward with the engagement. In Prussia, officials were equally unhappy. They'd just conquered Schleswig-Holstein and didn't appreciate the British royal family legitimizing competing claims by marrying into Christian's family. British diplomats scrambled to assure Prussia this wasn't a political statement. Helena found herself at the center of international controversy through no fault of her own. She'd fallen in love with Christian, or at least accepted him as a suitable husband, and now her engagement was triggering diplomatic incidents across Europe. The couple married in 1866, despite the opposition. True to Victoria's demands, they settled in England, living at Cumberland Lodge in Windsor Great Park. Christian essentially gave up any pretense of political activity, becoming a minor member of the British royal family rather than a claimant to German territories. Helena and Christian's marriage lasted 47 years, until his death in 1917. They had 6 children together and seemed genuinely content, despite the rocky political start. But the resistance they faced revealed how even seemingly straightforward royal marriages could become forbidden when they collided with the complex territorial politics of the era. Number 25. Prince George, Duke of Kent, the glamorous prince with dangerous secrets. Prince George, Duke of Kent, was the most glamorous and sophisticated of George V's sons. Handsome, cultured, and charismatic, He moved in artistic circles that his brothers avoided. He also became the subject of persistent rumors about unconventional relationships that would have scandalized 1920s and 1930s Britain. George was born in 1902, the fourth son of George V. He served in the Royal Navy and developed a reputation as the family's aesthete. He loved art, music, and fashion. He spoke multiple languages fluently and felt more comfortable in Paris or Florence than in stuffy British drawing rooms. But his sophisticated tastes came with whispers. George became known for partying hard, using drugs, particularly cocaine, and keeping company with people his family considered unsuitable. His lifestyle was wildly different from his father's rigid respectability. The most persistent rumors involved his sexuality. Various accounts, some appearing decades later, claimed George had relationships with men. The most famous alleged affair was with Noel Coward, the playwright and composer. Coward was openly gay in private circles, though public acknowledgement of homosexuality was impossible in an era when it remained criminal. Other rumours linked George to various aristocratic men in London and European society. Some claimed he'd had a relationship with an Argentinian diplomat. Others whispered about his friendships with known homosexual artists and writers. Nothing was ever confirmed, but the speculation never stopped. George's drug use was more clearly documented. His family staged at least one intervention, sending him to a clinic to recover from cocaine addiction in the late 1920s. The royal family desperately worked to keep this quiet, knowing any public scandal could damage the monarchy. Then there were the women. George had a serious relationship with a married woman, Kiki Preston, known in society circles as the girl with the silver syringe, for her drug use. The affair was passionate and destructive, fueled by their shared addiction. The royal family worked frantically to end it. By the early 1930s, George's lifestyle had become unsustainable. The family needed to rehabilitate his image and settle him down. They arranged his marriage to Princess Marina of Greece in 1934. Marina was beautiful, sophisticated, and from an acceptable royal family. The wedding was presented as a great love match. The marriage did seem to stabilize George. He and Marina had 3 children, and he appeared to commit to a more conventional life. But the rumors about his past never completely disappeared. Too many people in elite circles knew or suspected the truth about his earlier relationships. George died tragically in 1942 when his military aircraft crashed in Scotland. He was only 39. His death spawned additional conspiracy theories. Some claimed he was on a secret mission, others that the crash wasn't accidental. What's actually true about George's romantic and sexual life? It's impossible to know with certainty. The royal family destroyed or controlled most private papers. The people who really knew maintained discretion out of loyalty or fear. But the persistent rumors revealed how difficult it was for a royal to live authentically when their true nature conflicted with institutional expectations. Number 26. Princess Alexandra of Kent. The princess who married on her own terms. Princess Alexandra is Prince George, Duke of Kent's daughter, born in 1936. She represents a transitional generation of royals, too young to remember pre-war restrictions, but not young enough to fully benefit from the modern loosening of royal protocols. Her romantic life navigated this tricky middle ground. Alexandra grew up in tragedy. Her father died in a plane crash when she was 6. Her mother, Princess Marina, raised Alexandra and her siblings with continental sophistication but British royal duty. Marina emphasized both independence and responsibility, a sometimes contradictory combination. As Alexandra came of age in the 1950s and early 1960s, the royal family's rules about marriage were in flux. The Queen's sister, Margaret, had just been forced to abandon Peter Townsend. The institution was hyper-alert to any romantic choice that might cause scandal. Alexandra moved in fashionable circles, attending parties and cultural events. She was beautiful, charming, and popular. Rumours linked her to various men, including some who weren't considered quite suitable. The tabloid press began watching her closely, hungry for stories about royal romance. There were whispers about a relationship with a commoner, possibly someone in business or the arts. Details remain vague. Alexandra was better at privacy than many of her cousins. But the royal family definitely grew concerned about her romantic independence and desire to make her own choices. Under pressure to settle down with someone acceptable, Alexandra married the Honourable Angus Ogilvy in 1963. Ogilvy was son of the Earl of Airlie, making him aristocratic enough to be acceptable but not royal. The Queen offered to create him a prince, but Ogilvy refused, wanting to maintain his independence and business career. This choice itself was progressive for the era. A royal marrying a commoner who then rejected a royal title was almost unheard of. It suggested Alexandra wanted a partnership with some equality, not a traditional royal marriage where her husband would be defined solely by his relationship to her. The marriage had its challenges. Ogilvy's business dealings sometimes created controversy and embarrassment for the royal family. Alexandra had to balance supporting her husband with managing her royal duties. It wasn't always easy. Alexandra and Angus had 2 children together and remained married until his death in 2004. By most measures, it was a successful union. But Alexandra had to fight for the right to marry someone who wasn't a foreign prince, who refused royal titles, and who maintained his own career. What made Alexandra's situation forbidden wasn't anything scandalous. It was simply that she wanted romantic autonomy during a period when the royal family was still trying to maintain tight control. She wanted to marry for affection rather than alliance, to someone who would be a partner rather than a subordinate. She succeeded, but only by navigating carefully between modern desires and institutional expectations. Alexandra represents a generation of royals caught between 2 worlds, no longer willing to accept arranged marriages, but not yet free to choose without constraint. Number 27, Princess Victoria, the daughter who sacrificed everything for mother. Princess Victoria, born in 1868, lived one of the saddest lives in royal history. She was Edward VII's second daughter, and her romantic life, or lack thereof, became a tragedy of duty, maternal control, and opportunities forever lost. Victoria was pretty, musical, and lively as a young woman. She had a sharp wit and could have been a brilliant society hostess if given the chance. But one fact dominated her existence. Her mother, Queen Alexandra, didn't want to let her go. Alexandra had married into the British royal family from Denmark. She'd endured decades of her husband Edward's infidelities and found comfort in her children, particularly her daughters. Victoria became the daughter who stayed, the one who sacrificed marriage to care for her mother. In her 20s, Victoria had romantic prospects. There were suitable young men who showed interest, but Alexandra subtly discouraged every potential relationship. She didn't forbid marriage outright. That would have been too obviously controlling. Instead, she created emotional pressure, implying she needed Victoria, that it would be cruel to abandon her. Victoria, dutiful and loving, couldn't bring herself to defy her mother. Every time a possible suitor appeared, Alexandra's health would conveniently worsen, or she'd become melancholy, or she'd remind Victoria how lonely she'd be without her. The emotional manipulation was masterful and devastating. As Victoria moved into her 30s, the window for marriage was closing. In Edwardian society, women who weren't married by their mid-30s were increasingly unlikely to find husbands. Victoria watched her younger sister Maud marry and move to Norway. She remained at her mother's side. There are hints that Victoria may have loved someone in particular, possibly a courtier or military officer. But nothing could come of it. The relationship, if it existed, was quietly ended. Victoria accepted her fate, permanent spinsterhood in service to her mother. The arrangement became even more suffocating after Edward VII's death in 1910. Alexandra was now the Queen Mother, and Victoria became her constant companion, secretary, and caretaker. They travelled together, attended events together, lived together. Victoria had no independent life whatsoever. Friends reported that Victoria became increasingly bitter and difficult as she aged. Who could blame her? She watched other women marry, have children, create their own households. She remained trapped in her childhood home, performing duties without authority, caring for a mother who loved her but had selfishly destroyed her romantic chances. Victoria was in her late 40s when Alexandra finally died in 1925. By then, it was far too late for marriage or children. Victoria lived on another 10 years, dying in 1935 at 67. She'd spent her entire adult life waiting on her mother. The cruelest part. Alexandra probably believed she was doing the right thing. She genuinely needed Victoria's company and support. She couldn't imagine life without her daughter nearby. But her need became Victoria's prison. Victoria's forbidden love, whether for a specific person or simply for the abstract possibility of marriage and independence, was forbidden by maternal selfishness, masquerading as maternal love. She sacrificed everything to duty and received in return only loneliness and regret. Number 28. Prince Leopold, Duke of Albany, the invalid who defied his disease for love. Prince Leopold, Queen Victoria's 8th child, faced romantic obstacles that had nothing to do with scandal or inappropriate choices. His forbidden love story was shaped entirely by his haemophilia, a genetic disease that terrified the Victorian medical establishment and constrained every aspect of his short life. Leopold was born in 1853 and almost immediately showed symptoms of haemophilia. The slightest bruise could cause dangerous bleeding. A minor cut could be life-threatening. He spent much of his childhood in isolation, wrapped in protective padding, forbidden from the normal rough play other boys enjoyed. Victoria loved Leopold, but lived in constant fear for him. She'd already lost 2 children and couldn't bear to lose another. Her protectiveness became suffocating. Leopold was extraordinarily intelligent, artistic, and longed for independence. But his disease made autonomy nearly impossible. As Leopold reached adulthood, the question of marriage arose. This created a dilemma for the royal family. Should he marry at all? His haemophilia was hereditary. Any daughters might be carriers. Any sons might have the disease. Was it responsible to risk passing this suffering to another generation? Medical knowledge in the 1870s was primitive. Doctors didn't fully understand genetic inheritance. They knew haemophilia ran in families, but couldn't predict or prevent it. Some physicians advised Leopold not to marry, suggesting it would be cruel to any potential children. Beyond genetics, there was the practical question of whether Leopold could survive marriage and fatherhood. His health was fragile. He had frequent bleeding episodes that left him weak and in pain. Would the physical demands of married life be too much? Leopold desperately wanted to marry. He resented being treated as an invalid, hated the assumption that his disease disqualified him from normal adult life. He wanted love, companionship, and the dignity of his own household. He wanted to be seen as a man, not merely a patient. In 1882, after years of Victoria's reluctance, Leopold married Princess Helena of Waldeck and Pyrmont. Helena was willing to accept the risks, and Leopold was determined to have this one piece of normal life. Victoria finally consented, though her fears never abated. The marriage was happy but brief. Leopold and Helena had 2 children, a daughter who was a haemophilia carrier and a son who was spared the disease. For 2 years, Leopold experienced the married life he'd fought so hard to have. Then, in 1884, at just 30 years old, Leopold died from a fall in France. The minor injury caused cerebral hemorrhage that killed him. Victoria's worst fears had come true. but Leopold had at least lived on his own terms for a little while. Helena was left a widow at 22, with 2 small children and memories of a husband who'd defied his disease long enough to find love. Leopold's son, Charles Edward, would later become Duke of Saxe-Coburg, and Gotha, ironically achieving robust health that his father never knew. Leopold's forbidden love wasn't forbidden by law or church or royal protocol. It was forbidden by biology, by a genetic mutation that made every aspect of life dangerous. His determination to marry anyway, to refuse to let his disease define his entire existence, was an act of quiet courage that deserves to be remembered. Number 29, Princess Alice, Countess of Athlone, the minor royal who chose affection over bloodline. Princess Alice was Queen Victoria's granddaughter, born in 1883 to Prince Leopold, Duke of Albany. Her romantic life was shaped by the complex intersection of royal expectations, diminished royal status, and the upheavals of World War I that destroyed the old European order. Alice's position was complicated from birth. Her father died before she was born, making her a royal orphan with a title but little real power or wealth. She was raised in relative obscurity compared to more prominent royals, aware she was part of the family, but definitely on its periphery. As Alice came of age in the early 1900s, the question of marriage loomed. She needed to marry someone of appropriate rank, but her options were constrained. She wasn't important enough to make a major political alliance, but she was too royal to marry a commoner without causing family concern. The royal family had expectations about who Alice should marry. They suggested various minor German princes, believing she should strengthen the family's German connections. These were the traditional candidates for lesser royals, men of adequate birth who needed wives from established families. But Alice had her own ideas. She'd met Prince Alexander of Teck, known as Algy, and found him charming, intelligent, and sympathetic. There was a significant problem. Algy's mother had been born into minor nobility, making his bloodline slightly questionable by strict royal standards. The Tecks were a complicated family. Algy's sister Mary had married the future George V, making her the future queen. But the Teck family itself was considered somewhat marginal, royal by designation, but without ancient lineage. They'd struggled with poverty in the generation before, an embarrassment for any royal house. Some family members questioned whether Alice should marry Algy. Was his background quite good enough? Would this be settling? Shouldn't she hold out for someone with more impeccable credentials? The whispered doubts put pressure on the young couple. Alice married Algy in 1904, choosing affection over dynastic calculation. It was a progressive decision for the era, prioritizing compatibility over bloodline purity. They would remain married for 53 years, proving the skeptics wrong about the strength of their partnership. But their marriage faced another test during World War I. Anti-German sentiment in Britain was so intense that the royal family was forced to abandon their German names and titles. The Tecks became the Athlones, anglicizing themselves to survive the political climate. Alice and Algy spent much of their married life abroad, serving in various official capacities in South Africa and Canada. They were essentially exiled from the center of royal life, useful enough to represent the crown overseas, but not important enough to remain in Britain. The constraints Alice faced weren't dramatic or scandalous. They were the subtle limitations placed on minor royals, expectations about suitable matches, pressure to marry for dynasty rather than affection, the understanding that personal desires mattered less than family strategy. Alice lived to be 97, dying in 1981. She'd seen the world transform from Victorian rigidity to modern flexibility. By the end of her life, royals married commoners regularly, and the old rules about bloodline purity had largely dissolved. But in her youth, she'd had to fight quietly for the simple right to marry the man she actually loved. Number 30, Princess Margaret of Connaught, the diplomatic bride sent to Sweden. Princess Margaret of Connaught, born in 1882, experienced how royal marriages could be shaped, and sometimes distorted, by political expectations that had little to do with the individuals involved. Her engagement and marriage became entangled in the complex world of early 20th century European dynastic politics. Margaret was the daughter of Prince Arthur, Duke of Connaught, Queen Victoria's third son. She was beautiful, well-educated, and raised with a strong sense of royal duty. Her position in the family was significant but not central, important enough to make a strategic marriage but not so important that she had much choice about it. As Margaret reached marriageable age in the early 1900s, her family began considering potential husbands. The royal matchmaking machinery focused on men who could strengthen Britain's diplomatic position. Love was essentially irrelevant. What mattered was alliance. The family settled on Prince Gustaf Adolf of Sweden as the ideal match. He was heir to the Swedish throne, Protestant, and the marriage would strengthen British-Swedish relations. On paper, it was perfect. For Margaret personally, it was less clear. There are suggestions that Margaret may have had feelings for someone else, possibly a British aristocrat or military officer, but such preferences were swept aside. Royal women of her generation understood that their romantic feelings were subordinate to family strategy. She was expected to accept the Swedish match gracefully. The engagement was announced in 1905, and Margaret dutifully moved forward with preparations. The marriage would mean leaving Britain permanently, learning Swedish, and adapting to a foreign court's customs. Her entire life would change to serve diplomatic purposes. The wedding took place in 1905 at Windsor Castle, with appropriate royal splendour. Margaret became Crown Princess of Sweden, a position that brought prestige, but also isolation. She was now Swedish rather than British, expected to prioritise her new country's interests over her birth family's. The marriage produced 5 children, including the future King Gustaf VI Adolf. By the standards of royal arranged marriages, it worked. Margaret and Gustaf Adolf developed affection over time, even if they hadn't married for love. They respected each other and fulfilled their roles competently. But Margaret's life in Sweden was not easy. She remained somewhat foreign, never fully accepted by Swedish society, despite decades of service. She missed Britain and her family. The role she'd been assigned, strengthening diplomatic ties through marriage, required personal sacrifices that few people acknowledged or appreciated. Margaret died in 1920 at just 38, possibly from complications of childbirth or infection. She'd spent 15 years performing a role she hadn't chosen, in a country not her own, married to a man selected for political rather than personal reasons. Her story exemplifies how dynastic constraints limited royal women's autonomy. She wasn't forbidden from marrying Gustaf Adolf. Quite the opposite. She was essentially required to marry him. What was forbidden was the possibility of choosing differently, of prioritizing her own desires over family strategy. Modern royals might look back at Margaret's experience and shudder. Today, forced diplomatic marriages seem archaic and cruel. But in Margaret's era, this was simply how things worked. Royal women were diplomatic assets, and their romantic lives were shaped entirely by political calculations made by others. Number 31. Prince William of Gloucester, the modern prince who lost his chance at happiness. Prince William of Gloucester represents the modern end of this list. A royal whose forbidden love happened not in Victorian rigidity, but in the supposedly more relaxed 1960s and 70s. Yet he still faced resistance to his romantic choices, proving that some royal constraints persisted despite changing times. William was born in 1941, the son of Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester. He was 9th in line to the throne, educated at Eton and Cambridge, and worked as a diplomat. Handsome, intelligent, and charming, William was considered one of the most eligible bachelors in Britain. In the late 1960s, William began a relationship with Zsuzsa Starkloff, a Hungarian former model. Zsuzsa was beautiful, sophisticated, and successful. She was also divorced, older than William by several years, and Catholic. In the royal family's eyes, she was completely unsuitable. The relationship was serious. William and Zsuzsa lived together in Tokyo while he worked at the British Embassy. They were genuinely in love, planning a future together. William wanted to marry her, tradition and protocol be damned, but the royal family intervened forcefully. This was still an era when divorced people couldn't marry in the Church of England without special dispensation. The Princess Margaret and Peter Townsend saga was fresh in everyone's memory. The Queen's uncle had abdicated over a divorced woman. The institution was hypersensitive to any similar situation. William's father, the Duke of Gloucester, pressured his son to end the relationship. The family made clear that marriage to Zsuzsa would mean losing his royal status, his position in the succession, and probably his military career and diplomatic work. Everything that defined William's life would be stripped away. There were also racial and cultural considerations. Zsuzsa wasn't British, and while Hungarian aristocracy existed, she wasn't from that world. The royal family's prejudices about appropriate breeding and background were still very much alive in the 1970s. William faced an impossible choice: the woman he loved or his royal identity. Unlike Edward VIII, who chose love, William chose duty. He ended the relationship with Zsuzsa, breaking both their hearts. She later said William cried when they parted, devastated, but convinced he had no alternative. William never married. He threw himself into his hobbies, particularly flying, and maintained a busy social life. But friends reported he never fully recovered from losing Zsuzsa. He'd done what his family demanded, and it had cost him his chance at happiness. In 1972, at just 30 years old, William died when his plane crashed during an air race. The tragedy devastated his family and shocked the nation. Zsuzsa, watching from afar, had to mourn the man she'd loved privately, with no recognized place in his life or death. William's story is particularly poignant because it happened so recently. This wasn't Victorian repression or Edwardian rigidity. This was the 1970s, supposedly an era of social liberation. Yet the royal institution's fundamental resistance to romantic autonomy remained intact. The forbidden love between William and Zsuzsa proves that being royal has always meant accepting constraints on one's personal life. The specific rules changed over centuries, but the basic principle endured. You can be royal, or you can choose freely, but rarely both. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey through centuries of forbidden royal romances. From kings who defied their kingdoms for love, to princesses trapped by duty and expectation. These stories remind us that even those born into unimaginable privilege paid extraordinary prices for their crowns. Whether it was Edward VIII giving up his throne, Princess Victoria sacrificing her entire life for her mother, or Prince William losing his one chance at happiness in the 1970s, these royals faced impossible choices between their hearts and their heritage. Some chose love and lost everything. Others chose duty and lived with lifelong regret. Their struggles reveal the human cost of institutional power and the timeless tension between personal desire and public obligation. If you enjoyed exploring these fascinating, tragic, and sometimes scandalous love stories, please subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into royal history. Hit that like button and let us know in the comments which forbidden romance affected you most. Now, as you drift off to sleep tonight, may you rest easy knowing that whatever challenges you face in matters of the heart, at least you don't have Parliament, the Church of England, and centuries of tradition standing in your way. Good night and sweet dreams.